My grandfather never finished high school. He never called himself a craftsman, never had a workshop with matching tools lined up on a pegboard, and never once bragged about anything he built in his life. But on one Saturday afternoon back in 1987, in about 4 hours, using nothing but a hammer, a handsaw, and 4 broken pallets, he built something that outsold nearly everything else at our family's garage sale, combined. And I've spent years trying to fully understand what he knew that the rest of us didn't. Let me back up. That garage sale wasn't for fun. My father had just lost his job at the mill, and my grandfather organized the whole thing to help make ends meet for a few weeks. Folding tables lined the driveway, loaded with old tools, dishware, a couple of bicycles, boxes of things nobody in the family wanted anymore. By 11 in the morning, we'd sold maybe $60 worth of items total. People would walk up, glance over the tables, and keep walking. My father sat in a lawn chair looking more worn down than I'd ever seen him. My grandfather didn't say much. He just stood there for a minute, arms crossed, studying the tables the way he studied everything, quiet, patient, like he was reading something the rest of us couldn't see. Then he walked over to his truck and drove off without a word. He came back 40 minutes later with 4 broken wooden pallets in the truck bed, the kind you'd find stacked behind any hardware store or loading dock. The store manager had been glad to get rid of them, told my grandfather they usually paid to have that wood hauled away. Here's the part that stuck with me most, even as a kid who didn't care much about woodworking at the time. Before he touched a single board with a saw, he walked the length of every pallet checking something most people never think to look for, a small stamp burned into the wood near the edge. He explained it to me while he worked. Every shipping pallet is marked under an international standard. Look for the letters HT, and that means the wood was heat-treated, safe to build with, no chemicals involved. But if you see MB instead, that stands for methyl bromide, a pest fumigant that has no business being sanded, cut, or handled the way you'd handle furniture wood. 2 of his 4 pallets had no stamp at all, and he set those aside without a second thought. If you don't know what's in the wood, he told me, you don't build with it. Doesn't matter how good the price is. That single habit, checking before building, not after, turned out to be the whole story of that afternoon, and honestly, a good part of how he lived his life. He spent the next hour pulling the pallets apart board by board, using a flat pry bar and a rhythm that told me he'd done this more than once. The nails were old and rusted, some bent nearly in half from being driven and pulled over years of warehouse use. He'd tap each nail from the back before pulling it, which he said prevented splitting the board around the hole, a small detail, but the kind that separates a board you can actually reuse from one that cracks the second you try to screw into it again. By early afternoon, he had a clean stack of boards sorted by length, and he started building, no blueprint he was reading from, at least not one he showed me. Just a tape measure, a square, and decades of instinct from a generation that fixed things because buying new wasn't always an option. What he built wasn't complicated. A standing shelf unit, about 5 feet tall, for shelves deep, using the straightest boards for the frame and the more weathered, textured ones for the shelf faces, on purpose, he told me, because the rougher grain and the faded stamped lettering still visible on some boards gave it character new lumber simply doesn't have. He used lap joints at the corners, where one board is notched to fit snugly into another, cut with nothing more than a handsaw and a chisel. It's not the fastest joint to cut, and it's not the easiest for a beginner. But it's one of the strongest simple joints there is for a standing frame, because the notched pieces interlock and share the weight, instead of relying entirely on nails to hold everything together under load. By 4 that afternoon, the shelf stood upright in the driveway, sturdy enough that he leaned his full weight against the top shelf just to prove it to my father, who still looked skeptical. Then he loaded it with a few leftover garage sale items, some old mason jars, tools, a couple of picture frames nobody had bought yet, just to see how it looked filled. That's when everything changed. Within 20 minutes, 3 separate people who'd walked right past our folding tables without buying a thing stopped in the driveway, staring at that shelf like it was the only thing worth looking at all day. One neighbor asked flat out if it was for sale. My grandfather hadn't even considered selling it, it was just supposed to be a display piece, but when she offered $50 on the spot, he said sure, and helped her load it into her car himself. Word spread down the street the way it does in a small town. By the end of the day, 2 more neighbors had asked if he could build them something like that shelf. He took their names down on the back of an old receipt, and by the end of that week, he'd built and sold 2 more, plus a smaller version for a young couple who just moved in a few houses down. When my father added up the numbers that Sunday night, the shelf itself had sold for $80, and the 2 follow-up orders brought in another $130 combined. One afternoon project, built entirely from wood the hardware store was planning to throw away, earned more than half of what the entire rest of the garage sale brought in, dishes, tools, bicycles, and boxes of odds and ends included. Now here's the part I want to be straight with you about, because I know exactly what some of you are thinking watching this. My grandfather didn't have some magic gift. He wasn't a trained carpenter. What he had was decades of paying attention, knowing which joints hold real weight and which don't, knowing which wood is safe to work with, knowing how to finish something so it looks intentional instead of thrown together. That kind of knowledge used to get passed down, father to son, neighbor to neighbor, over years of watching and doing. A lot of it simply isn't passed down the way it used to be anymore. That's actually why I started paying closer attention to this later in life, well after my grandfather was gone. I wanted to build the way he built, but I didn't have 30 years to learn it the hard way, through trial and error, the way he did. What actually closed that gap for me was a library of tested woodworking plans, the same kind linked in the description below, over 16,000 projects with the exact joinery, the exact measurements, the exact details my grandfather carried around in his head from a lifetime of experience. It doesn't replace hands-on knowledge earned over decades. But it gave me a real starting point, instead of guessing my way through it the way most people do the first time they pick up a saw. I've built a lot since then, shelves, benches, a workbench of my own that's still standing in my garage today. None of it came from natural talent. It came from following plans built by people who'd already made the mistakes and already worked out the right way to do it, the same way my grandfather had worked it out himself over decades, one project at a time. Here's what I keep coming back to, though. That shelf my grandfather built wasn't really about the $80, or even the follow-up orders. It was about the fact that 4 pieces of wood everybody else considered trash became something people stopped in a driveway to look at, and something worth paying for. The difference between scrap wood and something people actually want isn't luck. It's knowing what you're doing before you start cutting, the same lesson he tried to teach me that whole afternoon, whether I was paying attention or not. If you've got old wood sitting around, a garage full of tools you don't use enough, or you just want to build something real with your hands the way people used to, the plans I mentioned are linked in the description and the pinned comment below. 16,000 tested projects, the kind of detail my grandfather would have appreciated, nothing fancy, just done right. Sometimes the smallest projects end up teaching you the biggest lessons. Mine just happened to come from 4 broken pallets and a man who never once called himself a craftsman.